Earlier, when we were rendering this auth context provider, you may have seen this value and had a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction because you know that anytime you pass a value to a provider, if you're creating that value during render, that's going to trigger all of the consumers to re-render anytime this provider re-renders. Because if the provider value changes between renders, all consumers will be re-rendered to get that changed update. Unfortunately for us, that means if we're creating this object inside the function body of our component, which we're doing here, anytime this component re-renders, all consumers will also re-render. And so your first instinct would be, hey, why don't we memoize this? So let's go ahead and do that. We need to use memo here, so we're going to move this up here because we can't use React hooks inside of conditionals like this. So we'll call React use memo. We'll create this object within use memo, and then we'll provide all the dependencies. But now hold on a second. Now we've got underlines for all of this, and that's because each of these dependencies would trigger this use memo to update because these are created within the function body as well. So this means we need to optimize each one of these with React use callback. And then that has dependencies, and set data luckily is already optimized with React use callback, so we don't need to worry about that. We just need to do the same thing for all of these. Okay, good. And then finally, React use callback for this one. Great. So now we've been able to memoize this value, and now consumers of the auth context provider will no longer need to re-render when this value changes. They only need to re-render if the user changes, because that's the only thing that can change between renders in our component, because it's the only managed state of our component. Now you might add all of this complexity to your code base, but you still feel really good about it because you know that it means that we no longer have to re-render all consumers when this provider value changes, because the only way that this could change is if the user itself changes, because that's the only managed state in this component. But let's actually take a look at the impact of the changes that we've made. We're going to go to our components here because we're concerned about re-renders. We're going to move this over a little bit. I'm going to log out. And actually, rather than components, we want the profiler. We'll bring that over here. And I'm going to start recording. We'll go to login as a user. And then we'll log out and we'll stop recording. We've got a bunch of commits going on in here. Let's take a look at what's going on step by step. So some of these commits don't actually update anything. Nothing is being re-rendered in this commit, so we can skip this one, but I'm going to select the auth provider so I know when that one re-renders, because if that one re-renders, then we want to make sure that we don't trigger any consumers unless absolutely necessary. So let's go over here. The auth provider didn't re-render, and right there. Okay, so this is when we actually logged in because that user was updated. And so we got everything rendered. Here we got the authenticated app. So we now have that user. And we would expect everything to render here because this is the initial render. And if we click on any one of these, we'll see that that's why it rendered. This is the first time that component rendered. Okay, so now let's move on to the next commit. Okay, auth provider didn't re-render. Huh. Okay, and then we re-rendered because we're rendering the unauthenticated app. This is the first time that component re-rendered because the user logged out. So unless I'm mistaken, I don't think there's any interaction I can perform that will trigger a re-render of the auth provider. Let's just double check that. We'll go ABC 1, 2, 3, here we go. And I'll start a recording again. We'll go to discover. We'll load a couple books. We'll add a book to our reading list. And let's stop that now. We're going to go to the auth provider, and it looks like we do get the browser router re-rendering and some of the components here that consume that, but the auth provider didn't re-render. And if we go through all of these, yeah, we're not getting any. I can just drag this forever. No re-renders of our auth provider. So with that in mind, why did we make this optimization? If this thing can't re-render anyway, then consumers will never get a new value, even if we were to construct that new value within the function body of this component. So this optimization and all of this complexity is actually not at all necessary. We can go ahead and leave it in there, especially for these use callbacks here, just in case somebody wants to put those in a dependency list. But even then, because the function body is not going to run unless we actually are doing a full-on re-render of our whole app, that's probably not going to be a problem either. So it's really important that you measure before and after before adding complexity to your code base, because you could end up creating a really big object here, having a ton of dependencies, and if you make one mistake in one of those dependencies by not memoizing it properly, then not only have you added the complexity, but you've also undone all of the memoization that you were trying to accomplish anyway. So just be careful as you're adding these optimizations, and remember that an optimization always comes with a cost, but doesn't always come with a benefit. Now, the reason I wanted to show you this isn't just to tell you to never use callback or use memo or optimize your context value, because very often you actually do want to do these things. It just so happens that this particular context provider doesn't really need that optimization. What you really should take away from this extra credit is that it's really important that you measure before and after and consider all of the impacts of your changes, rather than just assuming that an optimization is going to make things faster.